Thank you very much. I'm also grateful for the invitation to participate here. As you know, my country, Zimbabwe, is part of the settler colonial region of Africa. It was also not there for very obvious reasons. Okay, I'm not going to discuss the papers, be a discussant as such, but just try to highlight a few developments on the African context in the situation in the context of the Bandung to bring out some point. Like you, I was born a year before Bandung, so I was a very important aspect of the participation. A key question of Southern Africa that we need to highlight is that this South Africa, Rhodesia, and the Mozambique, Angola, not only were those countries not independent, but run by minority government to direct rule settler colonial regimes, but they were a critical component of the security regime of the NATO security regime in Africa. So it's a very important aspect to think about the Bandung process within the geopolitical positioning of the continent and how, in fact, the issues were very serious at that moment. The bulwark of the defense was, in fact, coming through Southern Africa. Yeah? And but if we think about the legacy of Bandung around the four key goals, Rupert's paper has a good summary of the main goals, and you do as well, around the question of the promoting or sort of supporting national sovereignty, decolonization, and racialism, the whole question of cooperation and goodwill amongst the nations, enhancing the position of these countries in the world system and their contribution to peace, and let us call it a kind of a developmental project, the social, economic, and cultural development envisioned around self-reliance. If we try and think about Africa's performance, or let us say assess what has happened on the continent around these four pillars, I would say that except for the question of the national sovereignty and the colonial question, and to some extent the racial question, the continent has done very poorly, and, really, truly speaking. But nonetheless, since most of the countries were not independent, national sovereignty was a priority. And we can say, I come from a country, Zimbabwe, let us say that about 10 critical countries became independent in the post-1975 period. Angola, Mozambique, the Lusophone countries, Guinea-Bissau, and then Zimbabwe, and then Namibia and South Africa. The decolonization project itself took over almost 40 of the years, 39 years, since the last country fell, South Africa, 1994. And within that process, decolonization itself became part and parcel of a key theater of the Cold War. So the whole of Southern Africa, for instance, was initially part of the Cold War security, the containment of the Soviet. And indeed, China was very interesting. Support in my country, one of our major liberation movements, the ZANU-PF, was supported by China. So we had a kind of a Maoist guerrilla movement with the kind of populist rural strategy, and the Russians supporting the ZAPU, ANC, SWAPO, MPLA, and so forth. China also supported a losing partner in Angola. But at any rate, the whole process of supporting national independence and the armed struggles was one of the, I think, notable legacies or developments of the NAM in some ways, supported by the non-aligned movement and so forth. And countries such as Egypt and Ghana, which were part of the Bandung, were important supporters from within. Many of the liberation movements were hosted and supported in those countries, including later on in Tanzania. So Egypt, a lot of training of Ghana, Guinea, yeah, and even later Cuba, Yugoslavia, was part of the NAM and so forth. So in that respect, and in many broader ways, training people in the newly independent countries, this whole cooperation and, let us say, institutional framework was a critical part of supporting the decolonization. First of those countries that were being handed over somehow, actually there were struggles, you know, your case is very interesting, in which the French and the British were at the end trying to get a quick compromise to decolonize, facing the struggles. And then followed by those countries in which the white minority regimes and the key colonial powers within the NATO regime refused to decolonize. Okay? So independence in Zimbabwe, unilateral declaration, was in fact sanctioned by the British, notwithstanding the fact that it was against them, because they never acted against it. In other words, the minority regime was actually sanctioned and defended by the South Africans and the Portuguese, which were all critical elements. So I just want to say that I think that we can look at that and see how even countries such as China, for instance, supported Tanzania, Zambia, which were in the front line of defending national liberation movements. For example, a major railway in Tazara trying to redirect traffic from South Africa to the sea, to the north, from most of those countries to the east, Dar es Salaam and so forth. So this is one very bright spot, a spark in the whole history, especially in those 39 years of decolonization. Of course, the question of racism, which the movement Bandung sought to deal with, endured in most of these countries, mainly also structurally, institutionally in Southern Africa. And I dare say it endures today. If you are reading about xenophobia or what others are calling Afrophobia in South Africa, you get a sense that you have an institutional framework that continues. The question of racism has not been dealt with seriously, and it's an issue that keeps resuffering in different ways. Okay, so second point that I wanted to make, I've made this point more or less, is that in fact, contribution to peace, and so this region, looking at Southern Africa, but also the Eastern Sudan, and the continent has continued to be a kind of a place where you have proxy wars that have sustained. Now it's the war on terror. Now we're talking about in Southern Africa. I've already mentioned the minority rule, but the proxy wars that were waged in civil wars in Angola and Mozambique after independence, which didn't end until the mid-90s, early 90s for Mozambique, were in fact notable processes of destabilization of big parts of the continent, so that the whole geopolitical confrontation and the national sovereignty attained was never stable in big parts of the continent. And so if we look then at the third issue goal regarding the consideration that was going to be placed on social economic, the developmental cultural agenda, this is the most disastrous part, I think, if we are going to talk about the African continent's performance. Insofar as the first 15 years, you know, if you take the median year of the 1960, 61-2 as the independence median year, the first more or less 15 years had some semblance of a developmentalist agenda, some, you know, state, increased state capitalism or protection, you know, input substitution, ISI industrialization. It didn't last very long. The whole by the mid-1970s, partly in relation to the more the crisis globally, and partly in relation to the entry of most of these states into structural adjustment agreements with these governments. So in other words, you have a break in a developmental approach, which had begun to take roots, at least in the late 60s, with all, you know, in the guise of so many kind of philosophies, African socialism, Ujamaa, self-help, you know, in Tanzania, and so forth. So the performance once by 1980, 81, 2, 3, most of the countries had fully liberalized, and in that way, it's closed the doors to any form of an autonomous development project, and therefore any basis for, you know, gainful collaboration at that level of the Bandung, the visions of the Bandung. And but one of the important aspects of the response in Africa was the importance placed on Pan-Africanism. Insofar as some of the main leaders that were participating in the Bandung were also products of a broader Pan-African movement which had many, many years in the diaspora as well, not just in the country. And in fact, the vision, we're constructing a vision of a more integrated African project which would position itself in the global world. Okay? And of course, there were this vision was there was a divided approach to how to deal with this, which weakened it. Although we did have the formal organizational structures, the OAU and so forth, and in 2002, an attempt to reconstitute that into the African Union to strengthen the structure. I think this is an important element, dimension, but more or less which is still an incomplete, unfinished business. In the meantime, what we have seen in the African continent is also some new forms of regionalism. The regional economic communities, sub-regional economic communities, they call them, Southern African Development Community, West African. So the spirit of regional integration and so forth exists, but the problem with much of it is being a dependent form of regionalization is much more openly, outwardly oriented, opening up towards trade, rather than inwardly opening up towards trade and investment. So it's a very, it's an important idea, but that is more or less subverted somehow, although there is a sense that more of the governments themselves want to come together on more concrete kind of projects, infrastructure projects. And in this respect, some of the new interactions with China, India, and so forth, the infrastructure developments, begin to take, to find a place. I don't want to talk too much about what's happening on the continent in the last 15 years, since the turn of the century, with the presence on the presence of China and so forth, because I have to speak about that later. Yeah. So in that case, finally, I just want to conclude that one of the important developments around over the last 40 years has been, in fact, the emergence of critical Pan-African intellectual networks. And although you was very pessimistic about the journalists and so forth and so forth, at least in Africa, the Codesrias of this world, and Mahmoud might talk more about that. I think he is talking more about that. Became an important aspect of mobilizing a liberation intellectual, certain autonomy, but also, as one of my friends said, celebrating one of the books in the 80s, you have to write your own history so that you don't get caught up in the trap that your actor described did. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that because I've run out of time, and I'll pick up some of the more contemporary issues in the afternoon.
那这两位先生的发言呢，都非常的精彩，给我们带来了非常新鲜的这话题。来自印度尼西亚的法尔德先生呢，他一再的提醒，在现在在印度尼西亚，在雅加达和万隆，在开各种各样的有关万隆会议的会议，并且不久，很快就会有全世界的几十名政要，齐聚万隆来开一个纪念的会议。那么罗伯特·比修先生呢，他恰恰讲到了一个万隆这一个怎么说呢？共同体之外的被我们忽略了的一个拉美的大陆。那尽管我想在座的中国读者都非常熟悉马尔克斯的《百年孤独》，但是可能我们读马尔克斯的时候，更多的还是去看了他的魔幻，而忽略了他的孤独。我们今天听到这个比修先生的这个讲演，才真正的理解什么叫拉美的孤独。那么这两位先生呢，都一再的在发言里边讲到这个我们今天重说万隆会议，实际上呢要更多的来看一看万隆会议以后，我觉得这样的一个讨论的视点非常的有意思。那么万隆会议是在1955年召开，也就是1950年代风起云涌的这个第三世界反殖民运动的一个高潮。那么在这个高潮之后，在参加了万隆会议或者接近万隆会议的这样的一些地区和国家，又经历了什么？又发生了什么？这一点呢，实际上是我们今天在讨论万隆的时候应该特别关心的。那这样呢，因为这几天我在看会议给准备的材料，那么我就对法里德先生的那篇论文《印度尼西亚的原罪大屠杀与资本主义扩张》那篇文章认真的读了几遍，真的是非常震撼的一个描述。当然像印度尼西亚的这个大屠杀我们也听说过，但是呢这样具体的这样真实的描述，确实让我重读之后也还是感到惊心动魄。那么由于一个专业的原因，我也对这个法里德先生的另外那篇文章，就是新秩序时期的艺术，印象更深刻。在那篇文章里呢，他讲到了苏哈托时代大屠杀之后，怎么样建立起来那些公式化的纪念碑。那么那些纪念碑的纪念怎么样掩饰了屠杀的历史，怎么样建构起了一个发展的历史。那这一点呢，确实也同样给我留下特别震撼的印象。我之所以对这个艺术这方面有兴趣， 也就是说10年前我对万隆会议有兴趣，是因为在那个时候一个也算是比较偶然的机会，我注意到了在万隆会议以后，其实是在万隆会议之前发生的，是在是在更早一点的时间，在印度先发起的一个亚洲作家会议。那在万隆会议之后呢，它发展成为亚非作家会议。那这一个亚非作家会议运动呢，我当时以为只是持续了10几年之久，因为到1966年，中国的作家就退出了这个运动，我们在中文的文献里边已经看不到这个运动的踪影。但是实际上，后来我又看了一些其他的材料，特别是日本方面的、韩国方面的材料，我才知道，甚至直到现在，这个运动也还在继续当中。那么，但是呢，在我们中国的文学史里边，这样一个运动，在文学史的书写里边已经不复存在，没有记载，这可能也是另外的一种纪念碑的建构方式。但是实际上这场运动，对于中国来说，是有非常重要的意义。那我们1949年，中华人民共和国成立之后，采取的是一边倒政策，在文化上，在文学上也是要以苏联的文学为主。那亚非作家会议运动开始这10几年，带来的一个重要的变化，就是一大批亚非的作品、亚非的著作被翻译成中文。这些数量之多、规模之大，是我们现在都无法想象的。甚至有一些翻译，直到现在，我们在大学课堂里还在使用。比如说像尼赫鲁的《印度的发现》，就是那个时候翻译的；像菲律宾的著名作家里萨尔的《社会之癌》，就是本尼迪克特·安德森的《想象的共同体》第2章里边拿了它来做例子来讲的那部小说，也就是在这个时代翻译过来的。那可惜的是呢，到了1966年，由于文化大革命开始，中国作家退出了这个亚非作家运动，因为中国的很多作家已经参与这个运动的作家已经被打倒和流放了，当然这个运动也没有办法参加了。但是我要说的是，即使是在文化大革命当中，中国也没有离开第三世界，甚至说呢，在某种意义上，在政治和社会这个层面，和第三世界的连带感，始终呢，甚至说更密切了。那这个时候，至少在我的记忆当中，我们的第三世界倒是紧紧地联系着拉美的。我们说的已经不是亚非，而是亚非拉。那大家也都知道，1970年代初期，中国加入了联合国。很多人是把这个中国加入联合国描述成中美关系变化的一个产物。但是即使在当时，中国自己也一再强调说这是亚非拉的朋友支持的结果。所以中国才获得了这样的一个政治席位。但是呢，确实，在我的印象当中，当然我没有经过非常严密的统计，但是在我的印象当中，改革开放以后的中国，第三世界这个概念当然还在使用，但是呢，我们大概也常常会说我们是一个发展中国家，那甚至可以说在很多的情况下是用发展中国家代替了第三世界这样的说法。那如果发展成为关键词，发展中国家成为自我定义的一个关键词，这意味着什么呢？这里边是不是有一些更重要的意义上的变化？是不是说，我们曾经反抗过的那个资本主义发展的逻辑，已经成了我们想要追赶和复制的一个对象呢？这样的一个问题，显然也是很值得思考的一个问题。从我个人的这个经验，至少我的感受来看，就是社会主义的理念、原则，在今天的中国，不仅仅是官方文件的一些旗帜和口号，实际上呢，它也浸透在社会和民众的层面。 同样，万隆会议以来积累下来的这些亚非拉人民的连带意识，在中国呢也是深入在民众的意识的这个层面。就像我刚才说的，由于有几十年的我们那个翻译亚非拉的这样的一个历史，所以呢，这样的一些文化和知识的资源，实际上也进入到了我们的现代的传统当中。我相信呢，它也会发挥在今天发展中的中国当中，会发挥它的作用。那两位先生也都谈到，今天中国的经济已经快速的进入了亚洲的其他国家，当然不用说，包括非洲和拉美。那么也出现了很多批评的声音。那我想呢，从中国内部也一个很重要的就是说，中国的经济发展到这样的一些地区去的时候，应该怎么样发展，也是一个非常重要的问题。那中国内部呢，也需要有一种批判的和反省的声音出现。那我相信呢，中国也具备这样的条件，就是呢，第一呢，我们和亚非拉人民从1950年代以来，甚至更早，已经产生的这种连带的历史，会使我们有一种伦理上的责任，伦理上的感觉所以呢，这样的一种深入人心的伦理上的感觉是一个很重要的基础。那会成为我们自我反思的一个重要的资源。就是在今天早晨，在我打开这个澎湃新闻，看到阿明先生的这个文章的一部分的时候，我同时也看到了另外一篇文章，好像是复旦大学的一位教授写的，他就是研究，他好像叫什么金砖研究中心的教授，但是呢，他讨论的问题就是安哥拉的中国投资安哥拉的模式是不是有问题？那个就讨论得很好因为中国在安哥拉投资的时候，前几年一个重要的条件就是用安哥拉的资源做抵押、做担保。那么这样的一种方式，这位作者呢就进行了讨论，认为我们今天应该超越这样的一种方式。那我想呢，这是一种很善意的反思这样的反思能够出现是很重要的也是因为呢，中国还是存在这样的反思的资源和基础。这是我的一些非常不成形的感想。谢谢。
So with 1/3 of parliament, in order to govern, they had to make all kinds of alliances, including with the landowners and so on. So that put a limit to how much they could reform. So they were redistributing, but not affecting the very rich. And the middle classes are quite unhappy with that situation. And now you have corruption problems emerging in Petrobras, which is big industry. So that is affecting the Dilma's image because of the social expression, but the basic poor working classes, slum dwellers, peasants are still very much backing the government. And in the rest of the region, you can see all of the governments. Evo Morales was re-elected in Bolivia with a great majority. In Uruguay, the same coalition was re-elected, and in other countries. So the people do want the reforms to continue. The problem now basically is for those reforms to continue, you really have to tackle the difficult issues of land ownership, where do the resources, extractive resources go, the power of corporations. So this will require great political force to deal with, and that is the challenge for the future. And this is why Latin America really is trying to fight against the international corset of rules that don't allow maneuvering space. If you try to raise the taxes on corporations, they immediately sue you, present protest, and so on. They openly fund political parties from the opposition. They create a lot of trouble. So I would say that the fantasy idea that everybody is happy and is really coming to an end, and what we have is a very tough political struggle.
His generation of intellectuals is providing a certain kind of assessment which longs for a multipolar world, but also has more positive assessment of the prospect of it, perhaps, especially with China's role in it. But I feel that for Hilmar Farid's comment, and also the next speaker, Dr. BISSIO's comment, I think Dr. BISSIO is more ambiguous, and Farid's comment is more critical in many ways, it seems to me. But you're shifting the perspective, you're shifting the focus downwards. So you're actually talking about the possibilities of social movements from below, right? So in that sense, I'm asking whether you can comment on the particular role Indonesia is playing, because I know that this transnational peasant movement, Via Campesina, which is started from Latin America, has now moved its headquarters to Indonesia. So something's happening there, which is very, very interesting. The connection between Asia, of course, Afro-Asia, Latin America, but also involves Europe and America as well. I mean, this movement is going beyond the third world. It is third world based, but it's going beyond third world. And Indonesia is now situated in a very important place. So can you comment on that role and what's happening in Indonesia in relation to that?
Today, and you're right, in the last 10 years there's been resurgence of massive mobilization of labor unions, farmers organizations, and in Indonesia there's a huge agrarian reform movement. And the interesting thing is that last year, 2014, there's been a change in the government, the rise of Jokowi. He's kind of popular in the region because, interestingly, he has no history in terms of political activism. 10 years ago, he was a carpenter. He was selling furniture. He didn't do anything, nothing unrelated to the movement whatsoever. 2005, then he was elected to become the mayor of a medium-sized city called Surakarta in Java, the major island. And then what he did was probably similar to what people like Lula did with the Bolsa Familia, so providing social assistance, social security to the population without any long-term plan. Yeah, his main concern, like more or less populist in that sense, that is to give away whatever the state can give, and then create a sense of ownership, participation within the population. And he was quite successful. In 2012, he was elected as the governor of the capital, really detailed out in specific plans. And he won the election with the support of a minority in the parliament, but there was a popular vote that overwhelmed the other side, so he won. But the situation is more or less like Dilma today in Brazil. You have minority support in the parliament, you have huge popular support, and your bureaucracy is also filled with different kinds of people, supporters and also former enemies, and also potential challengers to his power. So that kind of situation, a political situation that we are in. And I would think of this not in terms of political labels, that this is, say, like populist government, but think of it more in terms of space. The space that Jokowi's victory provided for the social movements. Like example, La Via Campesina is now legal. They can operate in the country. Greenpeace, after all these years, has now an office in Indonesia. And I think more and more of these like international, transnational social movements will eventually also affect the domestic and connect and building connections that I was talking about. Because now indigenous communities, they can sort of, there's a huge gathering called the Indigenous Peoples Alliance, consisted of like thousands of these communities, indigenous communities, and they are the ones who are now able to formulate laws, this change. And where is it heading to? Nobody really knows. And that's the interesting part, to be part of this chaotic situation in a way. No? But of course, we have objectives, and we are now really learning on how to sort of build a serious platform for discussion of different political tendencies, traditions, etc. Sit together and formulate ideas. I mean, that's the most important part, I think. It's too early, really, to make conclusions about what is going to happen. Yeah, this is only the beginning, and I'm very excited to be part of that. Maybe in the next commemoration of the 60 years, I can tell you what happened better.
Chile, and in Asia, Thailand, and an alliance also with New Zealand and Australia, developed countries that have aggressive agricultural export policies, and they have traditionally want to break the agricultural protection of countries like India. So that was traditionally the opposition of interest between people wanting to export and countries wanting to protect their peasants' agriculture. And this seemed to be a fact of life, because that's what your interest is. Now Lula looked at that situation, and in Cancun, he actively sought an alliance with India and created what was called the Group of 20, not the Group of 20 biggest countries coming out of the financial crisis, but the Group of 20 developing countries that said, yes, our short-term interest may be contradictory, but our long-term interest is to reform the trade system. And that was a group of developing countries on common issues like investment policies and intellectual property and so on, saying we have to unite around the common long-term interest more than the short-term opposition around issues of agriculture. I think that was a key moment of saying politics have to come before immediate interest. And I heard from Brazilian diplomats that they were absolutely crazy because they had never thought of sitting with India, which was like the enemy in terms of trade negotiations. But the political line was saying, no, you have to build that South-South alliance.